Chapter 2. In the Shadow of the Conquerors. I was born in Panama City, but I spent my early years in my mother's village in the Darien region, on the border with Colombia. My mother was a single woman. She became sick when I was a baby, took me back to her family home, and placed me in the care of my godmother, Mama Luisa. My father, Ricorte Tomas Noriega, was a public accountant in Panama City. He cared for me religiously, sending food and money periodically with my brother Tomas, who worked for a shipping company as a purser on one of the ships. Our family lived humbly, but there was food, and I remember being a happy boy. My little village was called Yavisa in Darien province, where Christopher Columbus landed on his fourth voyage to America. It was near there that Balboa crossed on his way to the Atlantic coast. Balboa crossed the mountains, and it was nearby that he first saw the Pacific Ocean. When the Spanish conquistadors arrived in this part of the New World, they established a colony near Yavisa and built a mighty fortress to repel their enemies. The ramparts are still there. I remember climbing the parapets in the ruins of the fort, a collection of old stone steps and mazes, 16th century ruins perfect for a little boy. My friends and I would scale the crumbling walls and balance on the towers, and then when we got hot as the sun baked down, jump into the Rio Tuira, Panama's largest river, for a swim. It is a jungle area, and the river is much like you would imagine the Amazon jungle to look. As in the Amazon, rubber tappers had come to the Darien to earn money by bleeding the sap of the rubber trees, then transporting raw rubber to the markets of the city. There was a mixture of cultures in the Darien. Some were descendants of African slaves. Others were of indigenous stock. Many, like me, were offspring of Indians, blacks, and the original European conquerors. In Yavisa, I began to get my earliest historic notion of Panama, who I was, how Panama was formed, the Spanish conquest, colonialism. We had a little school in Yavisa where my cousins, friends, and I received an elementary school education. My favorite teacher by far was my great-uncle, the brother of my grandfather. I am proud to say that the little schoolhouse in Yavisa still bears his name, José del Carmen Mejia. He was already an old man and had studied in Colombia when Panama was a northern province of Colombia, before the United States conspired with the French and declared Panama an independent state. Seated on the banks of the river, atop the ruins of that historic Spanish fort, Uncle José del Carmen taught me and dozens of other kids over the years the story of the Spanish explorer Balboa and his drive toward the Pacific. He told me how the Spanish conquered and killed any Indian tribe that dared resist them. There were barbarians among the conquistadors who thought nothing of humanity, only of gold. When Balboa came to the isthmus, crossing from the Atlantic, he came upon the mighty chief Caretas and greedily looked upon his village, all adorned with gold. The Spaniards were driven to distraction by the gold. So much gold, the tradition says, the chief even served water to Balboa in a golden goblet. Balboa and his men, of course, wanted to know where this wealth came from. "Go down into yon valley," the chief's son told them. "You will find much more gold than you have ever seen here or anywhere, all the gold that you need." Balboa never found El Dorado, but this was how he became the first European to gaze upon the Pacific Ocean. In his greed, Balboa kept marching onward into Darien. Finally, he was killed by a rival Spanish conqueror, Pedro Arias de Avila, who was angered by Balboa's having fallen in love with the Indian girl Anayansi. Avila ordered his capture by soldiers. Balboa was seized and his captors chopped off his head. The story José del Carmen told us was a tale of conquerors and the vanquished. The Spaniards, in their massive force against the Indians, subjugated Indian chiefs, indigenous people imprisoned, roped up, and carried back to Europe as trophies of their conquest. It is the history of Latin America, relived and repeated by the conquerors, who are ever ready to impose their goals and their values on everyone else. Whenever I think about what has happened to Panama at the hands of the Americans, I can reduce it on some level to my uncle's story of Balboa in the search for gold. Mama Luisa and I moved to Panama City. One of my earliest memories of those years was tagging along with the older boys as they organized protests against the Americans in the Philos Hines military treaty they managed to renegotiate with Panama. The treaty would extend U.S. control of military bases, including Rio Hato in Panamanian territory. Nobody liked the Americans, and it was easy to organize protests. The Americans showed no respect for Panamanians. There were problems whenever an American warship docked in Panama City. Sailors caroused at the local night spots and bars, got drunk, and started abusing Panamanian women. Fights broke out constantly. Usually, when the student union organized a protest, little kids like me were expected to hand out flyers and carry around tin cans for contributions. Earnestly committed to what our elders had taught us, we then marched right back to deposit every cent we were given at the student offices at the National Institute, the college where all the anti-government activities were centralized. One demonstration stands out from all the others. This was the Big Strike Day organized just prior to December 12, 1947, the day of the planned ratification of the new Philo-Science Treaty at the National Assembly. I was out on Avenida Central, in the middle of downtown Panama City, standing by a clothing store with the English name Best Fit. The leaders of the protest that day were two students named Aristides Urena and Moises Pianeta. They marched at the head of the procession carrying the Panamanian flag. There were other student leaders there whom I can remember, people who later played prominent roles in the country, including Manuel Solis Palma, who later would become president of Panama. Solis Palma, one of the main organizers, was arrested that day, as were many other student leaders. The student organizers knew they were lined up against powerful forces as they protested the signing of the Philo-Science treaties. They were combating not just the Panamanian government. Their targets were also the United States and the strong economic forces that controlled Panama behind the scenes. The term banana republic was coined in Panama and Central America, and a banana republic is exactly what we were. The United Fruit Company had massive holdings in Panama and throughout the region. It was in the company's interest to see the military ties between Panama and the United States strengthened and extended forever. When United Fruit wanted something done, it could wield its power. The company had huge plantations on both coasts of Panama. When a member of the National Assembly won election, it was usually with the backing and money from United Fruit. The same was true with presidents and, for that matter, with the National Police, the predecessor of the Panamanian Defense Forces. United Fruit became an extension of the will of the United States, especially in cases like the Philo-Science Treaty, which it very much supported. The National Police at the time were under the command of Colonel José Antonio Ramón Cantera, later to become a general and eventually president of Panama. He was under orders to repress the protest any way he had to, with gunfire, bullets, sabers, and men on horseback trampling demonstrators if necessary. I was standing with my cousin, Yolanda Sanchez, a student at the Lyceum for Girls, when the cavalry, sabers drawn, started moving steadily toward the crowd. There were people as far as the eye could see. They were jammed in everywhere along Avenida Central, where it narrows down in front of Santa Ana Park, right up the street from the General Assembly. High school students, teachers, elementary school kids, students from the university, their professors, were all out on the street in support of the general strike. As the cavalry drew near, people started to fall off and run to the side. Yolanda and I scrunched into a doorway as the cavalry moved into the crowd. But the protest leaders, Urena and Pianeta, kept walking proudly in the lead, the Panamanian flag held high. The horses were breathing right on top of the crowd when one soldier sliced at Urena's arm and cut the Panamanian flag right out of his hands. Pianeta, also covered in blood, fell to the ground. I was deeply impressed by what I saw. I always thought about Aristides Urena and could see the image of him marching in front of me, just as he did that day. When I became commander of the Panamanian Defense Forces more than 30 years later, I went to Santiago de Veraguas, where Mr. Urena still lives, to tell him about my vivid memory. He wept when I told him how I saw the soldier cut the flag out of his hands. After the attack, we all started running. The police were hurling tear gas canisters. Yolanda and I choked and cried as we ran along Avenue B, stopping in the doorway of a little restaurant called the Café Duran. From there, we ran into the old market down near where I lived and went around the back way up to Avenida Central and into the park by the cathedral. The demonstrators managed to regroup and were marching toward the Plaza de Francia, now renamed Las Bovedas, right in front of the National Assembly. The debate on the U.S. bases was underway inside. The organizers needed to devise a way to keep the cavalry at bay, so the student leaders gathered all the little kids together and handed out little bags of corn kernels. They told us to throw as much as we could onto the cobblestones in advance of the horses. It was easy for us to do. We squeezed in among the crowd unnoticed and threw the corn onto the pavement. It worked. The horses started slipping and falling to their knees on the cobblestones all along the road. This slowed the police down, giving the marchers time to escape along side streets once again and get back to the cathedral. The idea was to group right in front of the National Assembly and make enough noise to influence the deputies meeting inside. But the police soon regrouped, and this time they moved out on foot, rifles drawn. They opened fire. One student, Sebastian Tapia, fell to the ground. He was left paralyzed that day and became a hero to all. As we ran, Yolanda was also hit. Fortunately, she was only grazed, but some people picked her up and we went to the hospital. It wasn't serious. After that, we went back to my house across the street from the market, a tiny flat at 27 North Avenue, Avenida Norte, on top of a store called Compañía Avila. It was right up the street from the presidential palace. The popular reaction to the protests and the subsequent embarrassment were too much for the National Assembly to bear. Despite the pressure from the United States and the United Fruit Company, they rejected the treaties. It was a great day for the students, a great victory. I was, of course, too young to appreciate much of this. But as I entered my teenage years, I shared the dominant attitude of my fellow students toward the Americans. Whenever there was any kind of a demonstration in town, there would also be problems in the Canal Zone. Students would taunt the Americans and throw rocks. As they always did on such occasions, the U.S. soldiers set up barricades on what was then known as 4th of July Avenue. It is now known as Avenue of the Martyrs. That avenue separated Panama down below from the Canal Zone Military Administration area, situated on a hill overlooking the Panama Canal, to one side and Chorrillo on the other. There were barricades with concertina on top that made it something like the Berlin Wall, dividing the city right down the center. The area was filled with U.S. soldiers and Panamanian police. The soldiers were stationed along every inch of the barricade, more than a mile long. Anti-U.S. sentiment was very strong, especially after the incident with the treaties. The disdain shown by the United States was a constant provocation for Panamanian young people, who were developing a sense of patriotism and were already antipathetic toward the Americans. And it was all centered right down there on 4th of July Avenue. On one side of the street, you had American soldiers, American policemen operating as if they were in their own country, speaking a different language, flying the American flag. The only flag you could see in the Canal Zone, even though it was Panamanian territory. A student walking to my school, the National Institute, had to pass by the Americans on the way from Chorrillo and other neighborhoods to get there. If you dared walk on the wrong side of the street, the soldiers would push you and force you onto the other side. So it was pretty easy to see how the seeds of nationalism and pride for Panama could grow in such an environment. And if you take a look at the students of that period, you see some of the same people who helped negotiate the Torrijos-Carter treaties. People like Jorge Iueca, Romulo Escobar Bethencourt, Materno Vasquez, all the people present 30 years later for the negotiations that led to the signing of the Panama Canal treaties. I graduated from high school with general knowledge of many subjects. I had wanted very much to study medicine. Something had happened, however, that would change my life. Of all my brothers, Luis Carlos was always my favorite. When he graduated from high school, he went on to obtain a law degree from the University of San Marcos in Peru. He then entered the Panamanian Diplomatic Corps and was posted to Lima, Peru. Although I was not at all interested in a military career, an opportunity opened for me to attend the Chorrillos Military School in Lima, and I seized the moment, realizing that this would also help me spend more time with my brother. Chorrillos had a great military tradition, something that we in Panama did not have. I studied military engineering under a strict regimen, but the best and most memorable part of the week was Saturday afternoon, when we had weekend leave. I raced out of school to spend time with Luis Carlos, who became my tutor and mentor. Luis Carlos was a great conversationalist. He was highly cultured and had a precise sense of history. He demanded nothing less of me. He would take me to museums, to readings on politics, to lunches among the Lima literati, where I developed a sense of culture beyond anything I had imagined. These were wonderful years for me. Luis Carlos can turn the most mundane subject into something memorable through his ability to recall anecdotes and events that brought history and literature alive. Our literary outings included intellectuals, writers, historians. He was great at making friends, especially among politicians, the wealthier people in Lima, and the elder statesmen of the Lima cultural world. It was a rich, interesting time for me. He demanded that I absorb the lessons of history. Luis Carlos was Bolivarian in outlook. That is, there was no greater source of political import than Simón Bolívar's march for Latin American independence in the 1800s. Bolívar's goal was to unite Spanish-speaking America. The followers of Bolívar are a breed apart. They study the minutiae of the great general's life. They place him as a model upon which to contemplate current events and political developments. And so it was with Luis Carlos. Everything was a function of the Bolivarian ideal: Latin America's cultural independence, its unification, and its freedom from colonial domination. Yet there was something militaristic in this approach. Strange as it may seem, militarism and armies were no more than an abstraction for me during my years in Peru, even though I was immersed most of the week in military studies. The reason was clear enough. As a Panamanian, I could not relate to a military future. Ours was a civilian police force, for most purposes in the employ of Panama's elite economic power brokers. The Panamanian National Police was not something that a young idealist or a student struggling to find his way could focus upon as a goal for the future. Neither did my brother see his Bolivarian analysis in military terms. He was a civilian, a humanist, an intellectual to the core. He believed in diplomacy. While the military man sees the ultimate solution to conflict in weaponry and superiority of arms, the diplomat sees a solution in negotiations, meetings, and codicils to treaties. He believed that Panama's entire history could be understood by attention to the detail of history, hidden details that explain men's actions, that the only way for future Panamanian generations to overcome domination and humiliation was to understand and analyze the errors of the past. Thanks to Luis Carlos, I developed an intellectual life. But another mentor would soon come along who would also be a profound influence, a man who would lead me into a new career in a new world, a new professional Panamanian military force. His name was Omar Torrijos. During Torrijos' term as leader of Panama from 1968 until his death in 1981, and right up until the 1989 U.S. invasion, Panama was a changed country. For the first time, people from the country's poor neighborhoods, the son of the cook, the children of the woman who sold lottery tickets on the street, housewives and peasants, rose up from poverty into the middle class with newfound social status, no longer pariahs in their own country. Suddenly, universities were open to them. There were scholarships to become lawyers, doctors, and teachers. For the first time, people from the lower classes could even think of rising up to be ministers, members of the Supreme Court. Ask the powerful people of Panama, and they will say that Torrijos was corrupt, that the system had to be replaced, that thanks to the United States invasion, everything returned to the way it should be. The reality is different. Since the founding of the Republic, the predominant characteristic of the governing class has been that it is populated by rich white people. Everyone else was left to grovel in the dirt. They called them the criollos, or people of mixed racial background. They were slum dwellers, people of color, and they never had positions of importance. The very thought of finding a black person in government from 1903 to 1968 was virtually inconceivable. On the other hand, when Torrijos consolidated his power after 1969, after the attempt to oust him, suddenly we saw members of the middle class and descendants of the poor in his cabinet, in high positions. And this is mirrored by the opportunities given to the lower middle class, mostly people of color, who came to have civil service jobs and other positions that before were a privilege reserved for the Panamanian oligarchy and their closed society. I came to know Torrijos better than almost anyone, intimately as the visionary dreamer that he was. Yet even though I believe now that everything has a purpose, my chance meeting with Torrijos seemed an incredible stroke of good luck for a lowly cadet just graduating from military school.